Have you ever wanted to cube control like a pro? Well, this episode is for you. We're going to cover everything you didn't want to know about kubectl. In the last two lessons, we explored creating resources on our Kubernetes cluster, specifically pods and deployments. And to do that, we used the command line tool kubectl. I wanted to cuddle up to this tool really quickly before just letting you loose with the tool. Anyhow, I find most people never learn to leverage the tool properly and they really get frustrated trying to use it. Now, there are quite a few tools you could use to interact with your Kubernetes cluster, but kubectl is the tool that most use. It's the most readily available, and if you're looking to get your CKA or CKAD or other certifications in Kubernetes, they really test your ability to use kubectl quickly. Now I warn you, this is going to be a deep dive. Don't expect me to show you just a few simple commands. Those were actually in the last two lessons. So it's time to bust out your keyboards and clusters and join me, because today we're going to dissect kubectl's most useful commands. Once done learning to cuddle properly, once done, we're going to learn the commands, but we'll also practice using them as well, and you'll have all the tools you need to effectively use kubectl. While we will have plenty of examples of commands throughout the video, I recommend you use your own local cluster and practice along. A lot of being a good cuddler is practice. Later on in the video, David Flanagans from Rawkode Academy has super graciously offered to pitch in his most helpful commands that he and his community have found to be the most helpful while doing things like Clustered, a show he runs where people literally break Kubernetes clusters in malicious ways, and then he and others try to fix them. It's quite fantastic and is a great learning experience, so you should check it out. These people are really good at using kubectl to inspect their clusters and try to figure out what's wrong with them. So stick around and see what he has to say later on into this video. Let's jump into it. Kubectl is a tool that communicates to the Kubernetes control plane. More specifically, the API server that runs on the control plane. How does it do it? Well, the API server really is just an API server like any other. It has a REST API that speaks JSON. I know. It doesn't speak YAML. Bummer, right? Later we'll use kubectl to authenticate to the control plane for us and hit the API directly. But first, let's learn how kubectl itself connects to the cluster. There are a lot of security measures in Kubernetes, and a lot of them we have not talked about quite yet. But remember, layers and layers of security. We have to authenticate to the API server to send requests to it, so let's jump into that. This is where the kubeconfig file comes in. kubectl uses the kubeconfig file to configure itself to access the cluster on your behalf. By default, if you were using kind or minikube, it will create and put this file in your home directory .kube/config. And kubectl will use this file by default. This is why we did not have to really worry about it in the previous lessons and could just use our clusters. Most cloud providers provide a way to add their Kubernetes cluster configuration to the kubeconfig. Here are a few examples of that from the major cloud providers. As you can see, all of the major cloud providers make this very easy to download this config and insert it into the kubeconfig. None of these commands require you to actually touch this file, but it's important to understand how the kubeconfig file works and how kubectl uses it, especially in cases where you ever actually need to open and interact with this file. It's very important to understand how it works. First off, this file can have more than one cluster configured in it. So let's quickly cover some of the main features in this file, how to interact with it with kubectl, and leverage it to help speed up your Kubernetes workflow. Opening up the kubeconfig file, the first thing you will see is a version, just like you will see in all Kubernetes resources. Moving past the version, there are actually just four main items in this file: clusters, context, current context, and user. Clusters store data about the different clusters that are configured in the file. This includes where the server can be reached, its name, and certificate information. It's just a list, and as you can see here, we can have quite a few of them if we wanted to. One thing to note is that clusters, contexts, and users are not inherently linked. There is no user or context data in there, but we'll talk more on that in just a little bit. The next one is users. Users just holds a username and their authentication. Here you can see it is provided by a certificate and key. Don't worry, this is for a local cluster that I was running, and it doesn't exist anymore. These can be different depending on how you authenticate to the server. The next one is context. This is where everything gets a bit more interesting. Context is really just that, the different contexts that you plan on using. This is the cluster and user combination and can include the default namespace that you want to work in. Take note of this because this can really make your kubeconfig much more effective if leveraged properly. And now the very last main feature here in this file is the current context. And this is just the context that you are currently using. So when you use kubectl with this kubeconfig file, it's going to use the current context by default to access the cluster you want. Now, you could come into this file and edit this every single time you wanted to switch clusters, or users, or define whatever namespace you wanted to use by default. But thankfully, kubectl gives us some awesome ways to do that using the command line. There are also some other tools that are a lot more powerful that help you manage namespaces and things like this, but those tools are outside this conversation. If you'd like to see videos on those, please let me know, and I would be happy to make a video on all the different tools you can use to leverage and help you be effective managing a Kubernetes cluster. But that is outside the scope of this video, but there are awesome tools to test out if you're interested. But quickly, let's do this with kubectl. By default, kubectl uses the default namespace as default. Let's change that to the test namespace and use that by default. Kubectl config set current context current namespace equals test. Let's break this down. The first command is using config. This is just gives us access to a bunch of configuration commands. Next, we are setting or changing a context. We could update any context this way, but we want to change the one that we're currently using, so we can just use the -- current flag. And with that out of the way, we are looking to change the default namespace. And there we go. Now all of our commands, as you can see, run by default in the test namespace. Okay, but what if you don't want to mash all of the different clusters configuration into a single file? Well, that's okay too. And sometimes this is a very good separation. If you have a single cluster you plan on playing around with and don't want to mix its configuration into your production clusters, or a plethora of other reasons, it can be helpful not to mix it in, especially if it's going to be short-lived. To do this, use the kubectl command with the -- kubeconfig flag. This will let you give the path to a different kubeconfig file instead of just the one found in the default location. Okay, now we kind of understand how kubectl connects to Kubernetes. So let's start looking at the command line tool itself. First command. Well, okay, second command, I guess, because config was our first technically. And I guess technically, all of these are subcommands of the main command kubectl. Kubectl get resource. This can be used to get the current resource in a cluster and understand how that object is stored in Kubernetes. And really, as you will learn later on, this get command is just a wrapper around REST requests. Remember that everything is a resource, so this works for pods, deployments, replica sets, persistent volume claims, and even your own custom resources, something you'll learn on later. This is how Kubernetes works. Everything is a resource that a control loop checks and ensures is currently in the correct state, and if it's not, fixes it. Anyhow, my favorite flag to use with this command is the -o or -- output to change the output. For example, kubectl get nodes and kubectl get nodes -o wide, and you will see all the other useful data. But it doesn't actually stop there. You can have it print out in a machine readable format like JSON or YAML. But You can also use JSON path here, which is super powerful and probably its own lesson. Play around with it and the different options that you can pass to it to better understand the state of your resource. All right, so let's jump into the next command, kubectl apply -f or -k. This will let you apply a file or customize directory. We are not going to dig into customize right now, but suffice to say, it's a really powerful tool to assist in managing all your configuration. Apply, unlike create or edit, can do it all. This is a little bit more advanced when talking about the difference between create and apply, but it's also much more useful to manage your cluster with and lets you make updates based off of changes in a file that can be stored in a system like Git. This is the declarative way of doing it. All right, up next, kubectl expose. While we are going to go into more detail on services and the likes in a future episode, just know that this is a quick and easy way to do it via the command line. For the most part, this is not that useful in production or anything like that. It's just playing around with it in your cluster, giving you quick and easy access to apps running on it. Something you'll start to understand is I highly recommend you use the declarative methods and declarative methods in Kubernetes. And things like expose are imperative. Here in this example, you can see that I have a deployment and I want to access it. You can run this quick and easy command, kubectl expose deployment, and this is going to expose a node port service. If this does not make sense to you right now, don't worry. Later on, we'll talk about service and exposing your application. kubectl delete resource. This is my favorite way to delete things. That's about all the extra information I really know to add here. You can delete every type of resource with it, so go out there and delete something. Go delete something. Again, this is an imperative tool, but it's also very powerful, especially when debugging. kubectl create resource. While you can create resources in Kubernetes this way, I don't think that is the most useful aspect of it. kubectl's create hidden superpower is the ability to create base YAML files that you can then use and update and later apply to your clusters. These YAML files are hard to remember exactly what's in them and how they are formatted. I cannot tell you how many times I've had to come up with a YAML file to describe a resource and had to go dig around in code. It's not fun. Not only are there a bunch of different types of YAML combination files from pods, deployments, and services, but they all have a bunch of options and configurations themselves. With kubectl create the name of your resource, name --dry run equals client -o YAML, you can pipe this into a YAML file and it's already pre-populated with everything you need. You can then update the file with anything special and use kubectl apply -f myResource.yaml. This not only lets you check the file into a code repository easily, but if later you make changes to it and want to update your cluster, all you need to do is run kubectl apply -f myResource.yaml. And your cluster will have the latest configuration. kubectl logs lets you get logs from a pod. Mind you, as we have talked about in previous lessons, if your pod has more than a single container, you need to specify what container you want the logs with the -c command. Now, I want to warn you, if your container has not started yet or is failing to start or be scheduled for some reason, you might not see any logs from it. There are a lot of places your pod could fail before the containers are actually even running. Just keep that in mind when you don't find any logs for your pod. In these cases, there are some other tools that you can use to figure out why your pod is failing. kubectl get and describe are two that come to mind, but we'll talk about those more later. kubectl exec -it pod name --sh. And this is a fantastic tool for debugging a misbehaving pod. Remember, you're going to need to pass the -c flag and specify a container if it's a multi-container pod. I highly recommend you stay away from multi-container pods for right now, as it just causes more headache than it's really worth as of right now. As you can see, this command is quite simple and easy to use and mimics the functionality you'd find in another tool like Docker exec. kubectl debug is an awesome way to debug a container, but is a more advanced topic, I warn you. This command lets us add an ephemeral container to an already running pod. Why, might you ask? As you're going to learn in the future, it's best practice to strip your containers of all unneeded fluff. Usually that means taking out things like the shell and other debugging tools. Remember that exec command we just used? Watch as that command fails. Why, you ask? Well, there's no shell in this container. There is no extra tools in this container, like ping or vim. This is how I run all of my containers in production, as they have only the footprint they need. Absolutely nothing more. So this command lets us attach a debugging container, and this container can have such tools that let us check out and poke around on a misbehaving pod. This is super cool. Let's move on. kubectl edit is going to let you edit a current resource. I would say use this with care and more of a developer tool on your local machine. Most of the times, things in production should be managed by other tools, but this is useful when you're dealing with development on clusters and experimenting with configuration, as it really lets you quickly edit live resource files on the cluster without needing to have their configuration files on the local disk like you would need to with the apply command. Remember, here you can also use the scale command, but honestly, that command did not make my list, as I have never really found it that useful. I always just use edit if I'm trying to change something like this. kubectl describe resource name lets you describe a resource and is another really great tool for debugging the current status of objects, and is one of the first places I go if I see something amiss in a cluster or deployment. Remember when I was talking about not necessarily knowing, there's these states pods can get into where they break before they've even actually run and you can't get their logs. Describe can be a really good starting point if you have a pod like that. Do you want to know what tool has the best built-in documentation? kubectl explain. kubectl explain is built-in documentation, but really, really good documentation. The best part is it's from your cluster, meaning it's documentation on the resource for your version of the resource. Not only does it let you dig around, but it is also documentation right at your fingertips. Meaning, if you run into something and you use explain, you don't have to go searching on the internet for its documentation. So if you want information on the pod manifest file, you can run kubectl explain pods and get information on its manifest right there at your fingertips. It's an excellent tool when taking exams if you forget what manifest contains what properties. I cannot stress enough, if you're going to take the CKA or CKAD or the security one, you should really get comfortable with kubectl explain. It's a lifesaver. All right, so our last command of the day. This is one of the more advanced commands, but also one of the better commands to use while learning. I wish it was my first command I had learned to use. kubectl proxy is going to let you make calls like you were inside the cluster. This has a lot of use cases for debugging as well as learning, as you can directly interact with the Kubernetes API server without worrying about dealing with authentication with the kubeconfig file. Not only this, but it lets you debug services and things that are only accessible inside the cluster. Now, I kind of alluded to it previously, but okay, I kind of pretty much came out and said it. kubectl is basically a wrapper around the API. So everything, and I mean absolutely everything you can do with kubectl, you can do with curl. kubectl just gives us a quick and easy way to do it. But that is just the thing. There is so much more the raw API can do that kubectl, in fact, cannot. Let's do this now and actually make curl commands to the API server. I highly recommend you take an hour and curl the API server and explore it that way. It's well documented, so if you actually walk the tree, you can. Let's start doing that now with curling the localhost at 8080 where we proxied /API. And look here, we have a version. Let's actually check out version 1. Now let's run the curl to get the pods. Here you can see we get all the information that kubectl get pods would. It's just that easy. Now go out and explore the API. It's a crazy place and you can get lost for days. But this API does not even stop here. Whenever you add your own custom resources, again, something we'll get to later on, they will also be included in this API. You should learn to use it and get familiar with it. The only reason I say this is because as soon as I learned to use the Kubernetes API, when I learned to understand how it worked better, I understood Kubernetes so much better. So go out there and start writing curl commands for the API server. Just remember to proxy first.
And now for something completely different.
Okay. Hello. Welcome. Thank you, Null Channel and Marek, for inviting me on to share my favorite kubecontrol tips. Marek has already covered a lot of really awesome stuff, so I'm just going to share 4 simple tips to make you an expert with kubecontrol. Tip number 1 is going to follow on from Marek's combination of proxy with curl. And I want to show you how you can do this directly with kubecontrol. Let's take a look. So let's say we want to get pods. And let's do this in a namespace that may actually have some pods. Now, this is 2 tips in 1. Consider this your bonus tip. But you can pass an extra flag to kubecontrol to get verbose logging. You can pass -v equals a number to set the logging level. Now, when we do v9, we actually get an awful lot. Alternatively, I've found the v6 gives you just enough information to use part 2 of this tip. With v6, we can see the endpoint that kubecontrol is going to query for information. So now we can do kubecontrol get --raw and drop in something to the value. And we just need to copy the URL path segment minus any random squiggles. Like so. And now we can pipe this to JQ and we get lots of information. And in fact, we can actually modify the query param to just get 1 pod. Now for tip number 2. Sometimes when you're exploring your Kubernetes cluster, you just don't know what you're looking for. You may know that you have Cilium. You may know that you have Cert Manager, but you may not necessarily know the resources that they expose and provide to your cluster. And kubecontrol has a command called API resources. You can run kubecontrol API resources in any cluster. And this will give you every resource available in your cluster, including the API version and kind. What's great about this is that we can then grep for things that we know are available in our cluster. Now, I don't have Cilium in this because I'm using Docker Desktop. So let's just say that we want to find anything related to policy. And we can see the kinds that we can use any kubecontrol command. Not only that, we can see the registered short versions. So now I can run get netpol for network policies, and if I had any, we would see them. All right, tip number 3. Marek already showed us how to query pods, deployments, and other objects, as well as view their logs. But there's one more superpower to apply on top of that to make exploring your cluster all that much simpler. And that is labels. We can run kubecontrol kubesystem get pods. We can now add the show labels parameter to this command. And we will see a list of labels that are on these Kubernetes resources. Why is this cool? Well, now we can run get pods with a label selector and just say that we only want to see pods with label component equals etcd. And then when we run get pods, we just see the resource we want. The superpower here is logs. We can also use logs -l component etcd to get the logs from our etcd pods. Even better still, we can add the follow to tail the logs for all matching pods. Great for debugging distributed applications that scale above one replica. All right, last tip. Marek mentioned debugging and how the describe command is invaluable, and he's 100% right. But there's one other subtle change to get that will also make debugging a little bit easier. Unclustered, it's common for us to debug broken service selectors. If you know what that means, you've experienced the pain too. What a lot of people don't know is that you can fetch multiple resources with kubecontrol at the same time. So here we get pods, then we get our service. Things look okay. All right, what about the endpoints? Yeah, this looks cool too. But do I really need 3 commands? Of course not. We can do get pods, services, and endpoints in one command, giving us a good overview of our cluster with less typing. I hope you find these extra tips useful. Now, back to Marek.
Huge thanks to Rawkode for doing this with me, and go check out his channel, links in the description.
And that's it. Now you know all the best tools in kubectl. So if you need to come back for a quick refresher, no problem. Just take your time. It takes time. Keep using it, and it will become second nature in no time. Thank you all. Make sure to stick around if you'd like to see the next lesson, as we will be covering more Kubernetes topics one by one.